Well, joining me now, Radha Stirling from the campaign group Detained in Dubai, which she founded, and one of her colleagues, one of her colleagues, I should say, was held there. Thanks so much for joining us. As always, we need to start, don't we, I suppose, with that, to reflect the thoughts of some of the correspondents here on Twitter and elsewhere who say, well, look, you move abroad, you understand the system, you understand the rules, and if you fall foul of them, sorry, it's tough.
I mean, that's interesting, and that would imply that if you do follow the letter of the law in Dubai, you're not going to experience any trouble. But what we've seen over the past 13 and a half years is people can follow the letter of the law, but they can also end up in prison, forced to confess to crimes they haven't committed. And on this particular case, we've also seen veteran Andy Neal, who was accused of a similar crime. He was detained for more than a year until eventually they completely exonerated him and allowed him to go home. So this is quite a repeat scenario as far as British nationals being wrongfully accused of crimes. And in this particular case, Billy Hood has been accused of possessing, trafficking and selling these tiny little bottles of mixed CBD vape oil that cannot get you high, that really have no effect, and in fact were left in his possession accidentally by a visitor from London. And yet he's being sentenced to 25 years. And this is largely because the Dubai police are incentivised to secure drugs convictions, and they do not care whether there is evidence against that person to prove the guilt. If there is no evidence, they will force you to confess, and they will use that conviction, that confession, to secure a conviction in what is a 15-minute trial with no chance of defending oneself. In Billy's case, when he was arrested, he was taken into custody and he was beaten and tasered and locked away without any access to a telephone, the embassy, or a lawyer. And he was told that he would never be free unless he confessed to these crimes. And most people in that situation, they do confess and hope that their lawyer can work it out later for them. But in a system like the UAE has proven itself to be, and a country that the United Kingdom courts refuse to extradite to because of unfair trials, forced confessions, and the real risk of human rights violations, it's a serious risk that this conviction will not actually be overturned on appeal next week, where it's scheduled to be heard again.
Radha, I'm loath to say this because I'm really quite convinced by what you're telling us, but I think as a legal nicety, or at least a journalistic nicety, I need to say that the other side of the coin isn't reflected. We don't have the police officers you mentioned who you're accusing of serious miscarriages of justice. They're not here to answer that charge. We just need to put that out there on the record. Talk to me about the appeals process then. Does this then move up to a more evolved legal stage, or do we expect more of the same?
Well, one would hope, but that really depends on how active the FCO is going to be in defending him and raising this case with counterparts, diplomatic counterparts in the UAE, who would then ensure that the local judges and the local judicial system really analyse that case, because without it, it can be an automatic process that again leads to the upholding of that original conviction.
I think some people will be curious in terms of what the methodology is here and whether there's any political motive behind it. I mean, is there any sense in which this might be seen as part of a diplomatic tit for tat? Is there a sense in which it's an exemplary sentence handed down to a Westerner, pour encourage a las otras to make sure that other people get the message loud and clear? Or is it something a bit more boring and prosaic, that actually you get sort of grassroots judicial processes sometimes which can, go out on a limb, and actually there is no high-level political interference. It's just a local judge doing the job that I imagine, I'm going to say the word he, because I suspect that's what it is in the Emirates, he has determined is the case.
I think in the UAE, the judges are usually foreign judges, and they almost always side with the prosecution, at least in the first instance. There is a great incentive for the Dubai police and prosecution to secure convictions, particularly in drugs cases, where they're financially incentivised and they're also given career advantages. The other issue that we're seeing with the forced confessions And, you know, there are several reports that have gone to the United Nations about beatings and other mistreatment of British nationals, largely comes from the fact that the FCO, as opposed to other countries' foreign officers, has preferred, we can clearly see they've preferred to prioritise their trade agreements and their diplomatic relations at a higher level and at the expense of British citizens. We've seen Lee Bradley Brown, who was killed in police custody, and the UAE refused to hand over the CCTV to British authorities, and nothing was really done about that. In other instances where there have been complaints about human rights violations and torture, the British Foreign Office has done nothing to investigate, to promote human rights, or to discipline the UAE in any way. We've recently had Baroness Whitaker and Andy Slaughter MP call for these kind of sanctions to be imposed upon the UAE based on these human rights violations. And we've even had them call for increased travel warnings from the travel advisory because they're, quite frankly, insufficient.
And Radha, in just a word, I mean, I mentioned that figure of 120,000 Brits in Dubai, amongst them one of my sisters, actually. In a word, what would you urge people who are thinking about entering into what for some people feels sometimes a bit like a Faustian pact, you know, the financial benefits of living in a tax-free regime? Everything works, it's an orderly society, clearly lacking some fairly basic freedoms. Somebody contemplating moving to Dubai right now, in a word, what's your advice to them?
I mean, obviously, to familiarise themselves with the law, but I think that the law is so complicated that it's actually very difficult for a British national to understand it, and even for the own Emiratis to understand their laws, because they are really vague. And on the one hand, I mean, we look at Lala Sharavesh, who was detained over a Facebook post. We've seen other people detained for holding hands. While walking down the street, you can see open displays of prostitution. So it is quite a conflicted country, and it's difficult to follow the letter of the law.